The scandal began, as so often happens with scandals in Foxborough, not with violence, but with an unwise preference for formality. The annual Rotary luncheon was taking place in the oak-panelled dining room of the Crown Hotel, a place whose steady atmosphere seemed to lend extra dignity to even the most banal chicken breast. The mayor had just risen to propose a toast to loyalty when a commotion in the back of the hall interrupted the proceedings. Mrs. Carter Brown, widow, benefactor of the local horticultural society and a lady not usually associated with breakdowns, was found face first in the pudding. Unfortunately, the crimson jelly wasn't hers, but the mayor's dessert, which he had preserved with the restrained patience of a man accustomed to civic sacrifice. Two Rotarians nearest her rose in alarm, while others stretched to see the teacup suspended in mid-air. "She's unconscious," declared Mr. Winch, the ironmonger, but his expression betrayed not sympathy but satisfaction that he had been the first to make a diagnosis. The silence that followed was broken by the sexton's wife whispering to her neighbour, "I've never trusted pudding. Too shaky to be healthy." Another person came from the other side of the room. Didn't she look strange, passing around the raffle tickets? A man at the bar muttered into his gin, "Well, that's one way to avoid the subs." And from the door, where a group of stragglers has gathered, mark my words, "It's these tonic waters," they say, "that keep the Crown open for weeks." Rumours spread like smoke. Within moments, Mrs. Carter Brown had died of heart failure, suffered from seafood poisoning, was plagued by a guilty conscience, or was simply overwhelmed by the weight of her own hat, depending on which chart you consulted. The management had summoned the doctor to restore order. But it was another figure who moved leisurely through the crowd, capturing the attention of those present. Inspector Purbright, summoned from his High Street office by a breathless policeman, arrived with the calmness of a man who had learned that haste rarely led to better conditions in Foxborough. His first act was not, as some had expected, to bend solicitously over the widow. Instead, he bent down beside the table leg where Mrs. Carter Brown had collapsed, and his gaze lingered for a moment on a small but incongruous object stuck to the baseboard, a pinned price tag dangling from a piece of green ribbon. He did not touch it. He merely examined it with the mild curiosity of a man watching the migration of sparrows. "No," said Purbright, preparing the kind of toast one would expect at a Rotary luncheon. The mayor, still clutching his glass, looked insulted, as if his prerogative had been abused. Several guests giggled nervously, grateful for any invitation to view the incident as amusing rather than sinister. Then Sergeant Love arrived, slightly flushed from running the last 100 meters, trying to appear competent yet invisible. At that moment, when the room seemed to fluctuate between embarrassment and relief, another surprise occurred. The doctor, who had leaned his elbow on the woman lying on the floor, pushed through. He suddenly stood up with a strange expression on his face and held up a folded piece of paper that he had taken from her gloved hand. He unnecessarily announced that she was holding it in her fingers. The whispering continued with renewed vigor. What the letter contained, and how a woman, known primarily for her church, flowers, and raffle tickets, could collapse during the mayor's dessert, were questions that could not be postponed. Purbright watched the note being handed to a police officer and briefly scanned the room, noting which diners were leaning forward eagerly for revelations and which were staring at their plates. Then, with a quiet sigh, he prepared himself to become entangled in another of Flaxborough's small but strangely convoluted dramas. The discovery of the folded note had set off a wave in the dining room, even stronger than Mrs. Carter Brown's collapse itself. Death, after all, wasn't entirely unknown in Foxborough, but a secret message from a lifeless hand was a thought-provoking embellishment. Even as the doctor confirmed the widow's death and the mayor began to mutter something about appropriate expressions of condolence, heads turned, eyes darted around, and lips pressed against the neighbour's ears with an urgency that belied the solemn occasion. Inspector Purbright, however, seemed deaf to the speculation. He stood at the edge of the gathering, his hands loosely clasped behind his back, while Sergeant Love, with the help of 2 waiters and a large pot of palm, tried to seal off. The policeman holding the note looked proud and confused at the same time, as if he had been entrusted with the crown jewels, but didn't know what was on top. Purbright strolled over and, with a slight nod, took the young man's burden. He unfolded the note with such deliberateness that half the room leaned forward hopefully. Their disappointment was clear, because instead of gasping or blanching, he merely raised his eyebrows an inch. On the note were only 5 words, written in hastily written handwriting. "Not here." Not like this. He folded it again and put it in his pocket. He quietly noted a message whose greatest virtue lies in its brevity. Sergeant Love craned his neck above her shoulder and seemed confused. "Not here, not like that." Sounds like she agreed to something, sir. Or like she didn't want something. Mrs. Purbright offered no further explanation. Instead, he turned to the doctor, who took out his stethoscope with a grimace. "Natural causes?" he asked gently. The doctor hesitated. "Well, there are no obvious signs of violence," perhaps her heart. "However, I must confess to the inspector that the suddenness gives me pause. She had always been quite robust." Purbright inclined his head. "We'll take robustness into account in our considerations." The mayor had meanwhile consulted with 2 aldermen, and now approached with the air of someone eager to put the matter to rest. "Inspector, I would be grateful if you could resolve this unfortunate incident discreetly. Mrs. Carter-Brown was a valued supporter of many civic causes. It would be extremely unfortunate if speculation, well, you get the idea, were to lead to this. I think it could best be described as heart failure. Lunch must go on." Purbright gave him a thoughtful look that didn't necessarily express disagreement, but certainly didn't express agreement either. "I'm sure the city will appreciate your desire for continuity, Mr. Mayor. Nevertheless, I must ask that the room remain untouched for a while. People's memories can be surprisingly accurate when they haven't had time to become inventive." This triggered a murmur among the audience. Several guests, suddenly eager to display their impeccable memories, immediately stepped forward. The inspector's quiet hint was enough to trigger a flood of voices. "She was sitting right at the raffle table," announced Mrs. Vine, a seamstress with a striking figure. "I noticed myself that she was a whole lot heftier, and she didn't seem to be getting any worse. Then she turned a little pale, but I thought it was the chicken. No, it wasn't until the wine arrived that a man from the law firm corrected him. She took just a sip and immediately put the glass down again, as if it had been reversed." "Nonsense," said the sexton's wife, who had come closer. She whispered something to the priest just before the sinking. He seemed quite frightened. From the corner by the buffet, Mr. Winch contributed something. I heard her laughing. Yes, laughing. She was giggling about something, and then boom, she landed face first in the jam. Each memory contradicted the last. Purbright made no attempt to reconcile them, merely listening with mild indulgence, as if they were all school children eager to show off their knowledge. When the voices began to overlap unbearably, he raised his hand. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Your comments are noted. Sergeant Love will speak to you individually." Love's eyes widened, but he nodded dutifully. While the inspector slowly walked around the table, his gaze remained on the empty chair, the neatly stacked lottery books, and the mayor, hopelessly contaminated by the tragic calf hanging. He squatted down again, this time examining the carpet under the chair. The snipped price tag he'd noticed earlier was still hanging there, like the remnant of a discarded gift. Frowning slightly, he covered it with his shoe until the crowd's eyes averted. The body was discreetly removed by undertakers, summoned with remarkable speed, as if deaths in inconvenient locations were a useful perk. The guests slowly returned to their seats, although the mood had lost its former cheerfulness. Glasses were raised without enthusiasm. The cutlery clinked more quietly than usual, but amid the subdued solemnity, gossip still flourished. Sergeant Love, extremely conscientious, had positioned himself at the sideboard, jotting down names in a notebook, but the flood of speculation he received could hardly be captured in shorthand. Several witnesses admitted that Mrs. Carter Brown had been in trouble recently, with the nature of the problems ranging from unpaid bills at the milliner's to unpleasant company with the organists. Each speaker seemed pleased to hint at their knowledge, but was reluctant to go into detail. Purbright, who had temporarily taken a seat next to the mayor, seemed unfazed by the chatter. He stirred his coffee, sipped it, and then asked, with quiet interest, "Tell me, Mr. Mayor, was the widow involved in the preparations for this luncheon?" The mayor blinked. "Arrangements? Well, I guess she offered me some help with the raffle. She was always happy to lend a hand, but beyond that I don't think so." "And the prizes?" Purbright's gaze was expressionless. "Were they donated by members?" "But yes, of course, a bottle of whiskey, some gardening tools, things like that." The mayor hesitated, then added, "Why do you ask?" "Pure curiosity." Purbright let the words sink in without explanation. Then he stood up and brushed a crumb off his sleeve. "Sergeant Love, if you've collected enough memories for a fortnight, perhaps we can speak with the hotel staff." Love, who was just being assured by the sexton's wife that she clearly remembered seeing Mrs. Carter Brown, cast a meaningful glance at the salt cellar and seemed relieved by the reprieve. He hurried after her into the corridor. There, away from the crowd, Love asked in a low voice, "Do you think it's poison, sir?" Purbright shrugged slightly. If that's true, then the timing was remarkably theatrical. But let's not jump to conclusions. Often what people believe is more dramatic than what actually happened. As they passed the cloakroom, Purbright's gaze fell again on the piece of ribbon and tag he had previously hidden near his shoe. He paused only briefly, then continued on his way with the leisurely confidence of a man who had already tucked it away in a quiet drawer of his mind for later reflection. The hotel manager, summoned with obvious reluctance, denied any possibility of guilt. "Our kitchens are spotless, Inspector, spotless. Nothing questionable comes out. I would swear to that before the council myself." He dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. "And the wine is the same one we serve at every banquet. Never a complaint." "Your staff," Purbright asked gently, "have you noticed any irregularities in the behaviour of the guests this afternoon?" The manager wrung his hands. "Any irregularities, except that she arrived rather early and seemed, well, distracted. She kept asking if all the raffle prizes had been organised yet. I was almost nervous about it." "Ah," Purbright said quietly. "Thank you, that's helpful." As they stepped back out into the twilight on the high street, the inspector's mind seemed elsewhere. He commented on the whispers already drifting from shop door to shop door, rumours of poison, scandal, and mysterious notes. Instead, he walked deliberately toward the police station, Love at his side, carrying with him not only the widow's note, but also the silent memory of the dangling price tag. The town of Flaxborough, for all its inventiveness, was rarely resourceful without provocation, and that provocation, Purbright suspected, had only just begun to make itself felt. The next morning brought a deceptive calm to Flaxborough's main street. Butchers arranged their roasts in gleaming rows, the baker stacked loaves into aromatic pyramids, and in the florist's window chrysanthemums presented themselves with a solemnity more suggestive of grief than any undertaker could ever achieve. But beneath the superficial hum of commercial life lay the eager vibration of gossip that had fermented overnight. Mrs. Carter Brown's breakdown at the Rotary luncheon had not only kept tongues wagging but sharpened them. What had once been a surprise had hardened into a conviction, one as different, however, as the shopkeeper himself. She was poisoned, hired Mr. Fenwick in the tobacco shop, and tapped ash into his tablet as if to reinforce a verdict. You can't look so rosy and healthy one minute and then turn to mush the next without help. The seamstress, Mrs. Vine, who had already told her story about the raffle tickets to half the town, confided in a customer she was afraid of something. Excitement, the inspector called it. I could tell. By mid-morning, the story had already begun. The mysterious message was common knowledge, but how anyone had learned of it outside of lunch was unclear. The wording, embellished with each repetition, ranged from "not here, not like that," to "not now, not as you think." And the paper itself, in their imagination, had been blue, perfumed, or emblazoned with a coat of arms. The citizens of Flamborough rarely let boring facts distract from their embellishments. Inspector Purbright, walking calmly down the high street with Sergeant Love dutifully trailing behind him, was less interested in the gossip than in its rapid spread. He knew full well that rumours often don't reveal the truth, but rather point in the direction where the truth lies most remote. He paused at the window of the Crown Hotel, where a small note apologized for the unfortunate interruption of the previous day's event, and promised that normal lunch service would soon resume. Purbright's lips twitched slightly, but whether in amusement or thought was unclear. "Shall we look at the raffle prizes, sir?" asked Love, cheerful at the prospect of practical questions. "An excellent idea," Purbright replied. "Objects can be more open than people, especially if they've rehearsed overnight." In the hotel's function room, the previous day's festivities still lingered faintly in the air, as if the walls were holding memories. One table, at the end, still bore the signs of the raffle: brown paper, neatly stacked packages, a bottle of whiskey gleaming in its box, and a set of gardening tools arranged with almost military precision. Next to them lay an open ledger, numbers and names recorded in careful but slightly smudged ink. The examiner examined the prizes like a gallery exhibit. He didn't touch anything, only leaning forward slightly to read the labels. "Whose contributions do we know?" he asked. The hotel manager, reluctantly summoned, cleared his throat. "All from members or their wives: Mr. Winch's whiskey, the ironmongers, Mr. Penny's gardening tools, the seed merchants, and Mrs. Vine's hand-knitted shawl." He hesitated, then added, "The others, a fruit basket and a silver-plated jewellery box, came from Mrs. Carter Brown herself." Purbright's eyes flickered. She was generous. "She insisted, Inspector," the manager gently corrected her. "She was very keen on them being displayed at the front." Love jotted this triumphantly in his notebook. "So she may have attracted attention, sir?" "Or to hide it," Purbright murmured. He glanced at the gardening tools. A fork, a trowel, and a pair of scissors gleamed in the light, their handles new. One still had a thin piece of green ribbon attached, roughly cut from the price tag. Purbright examined it with quiet satisfaction, and then moved on without comment. Her investigation was interrupted by the arrival of several townspeople who came to collect their raffle winnings. Among them, Mrs. Vine herself was full of importance and curiosity. She hurried forward to retrieve her shawl, though she managed to stare at the inspector with the air of one accustomed to being questioned. "Terrible business yesterday, Inspector, poor woman. But I dare say it's better that some things come to light." "Really?" Purbright's tone invited further elaboration. "It was impossible to miss," she said quietly, that she'd been getting quite close to the pastor lately. "And not just in terms of the pews. People talk, you know. Purbright inclined her head, unbidden, and she hurried off, leaving a trail of lavender and self-satisfaction in her wake. Behind her, Mr. Winch accepted his whisky, clearly reluctant to be denied it. "Pity," he grumbled. "I had hoped she'd survive long enough to pay for a pair of doorknobs." The murmuring continued as more townspeople arrived, each with a theory disguised as a memory. Then at the height of this muted activity came the first real disturbance since lunch itself. The vicar, pale and visibly agitated, came in to collect a fruit basket he had apparently won. His hand trembled as he signed the ledger, and as he did so, a folded sheet fell from his pocket. It fluttered to the floor and was immediately caught by the nearest pair of eyes. A young clerk picked it up and handed it back, but not before half the room had glimpsed the opening line, "If you value your reputation." The gasp that followed was so sharp that all conversation ceased. The pastor, flushed with embarrassment, put away the newspaper and stammered something about parish duties. His hasty and clumsy exit left such a thick trail of speculation that it seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Love leaned forward and whispered urgently, "This must be blackmail, sir." "That would mean he was careless," Purbright replied. "Furthermore, we should give our assumptions some time to mature." But Flaxborough was not patient. By the time Purbright and Love re-entered the square, a group of townspeople had already gathered, enthralled by the story. For them, the half-seen message from the vicar had instantly merged with the half-read widow's, a tale of secret arrangements, veiled threats, and sudden death spread with the speed of wildfire. The inspector, who observed all this with gentle composure, knew he must not extinguish such flames prematurely. Fire illuminated and destroyed. He returned to the station where Mrs. Carter Brown's note lay before him once more. Not here, not like this. He read it several times as if the words might rearrange themselves upon closer inspection. Then he carefully placed it next to the raffle account and the prize list. His gaze lingered for a moment on the entry labelled "Silver-plated jewellery box, donated by Mrs. Carter Brown." He tapped it lightly with a finger, then clasped his hands. "Darling," he said quietly, "the city keeps us entertained with countless stories. Let's be polite and listen. But keep your ears especially open when the stories stop. That, I believe, is where the truth usually lies." The sergeant, unsure whether this was instruction or philosophy, nodded with serious energy. He resolved to listen with all the sincerity at his disposal to every word the town would spill. By evening, the first phase of the investigation had already woven itself deeply into Flaxborough's life. Gossip had turned a lunchtime mishap into a public drama, the raffle provided the stage, and the vicar's unfortunate slip of paper provided the first comedic entrance. But for Purbright, whose eyes again noticed the green ribbon and the cut-off label, the real game had just begun. The embarrassment over the minister's lost note had reached proportions by the next morning that no sermon could assuage. Flamborough's Market Square, always a Saturday sight of flower-covered housewives, shouting fishmongers, and children tugging at their mothers' sleeves, became an informal court of inquiry. Not a cabbage or kipper was purchased without comment on Reverend Prowess's bright red ears as he stumbled out of the Crown Hotel. For many, his hasty exit was proof enough of his guilt in an unspecified but deliciously scandalous matter. "He's been hiding something for years," claimed Mr. Fenwick, the tobacconist who treated every puff of his pipe like a punctuation mark. "The only question is, what sin has caught up with him?" "Blackmail," whispered Mrs. Vine with relish. "You saw the piece of paper." "If your reputation is important to you." "Well, what else could it mean?" Others, preferring less sordid speculation, lean towards secret financial difficulties, unwise investments, or even an inappropriate sermon that inadvertently praised the Methodists. But through all these variations there was a common thread. The minister's embarrassment and the widow's death were connected. The town had decided that it was just a matter of embellishing the story. Inspector Purbright, leisurely as ever, continued the embellishments. He had learned long ago that when the citizens of Flamborough were convinced of one thing, the truth usually lay hidden in another. That afternoon he paid a visit to the rectory, with Sergeant Love trailing faithfully behind him. Reverend Prowse received them in his study, a room filled with books whose spines bore witness to centuries of orthodoxy, but whose dust betrayed decades of neglect. The clergyman himself appeared more haggard than saintly. He clasped his hands as if in incessant prayer, but the trembling of his fingers suggested nervousness rather than piety. I accepted, beginning with a nervous laugh that ended far too quickly. "You've come because of yesterday's unfortunate scene? I'm afraid my clumsiness has added unnecessary drama to your examination." "Not unnecessarily," said Purbright with mild politeness. "In the theatre, character often reveals itself more quickly than in conversation." Prowse blushed. The message people might have seen was completely different from what they expected. It wasn't addressed to me personally. I was asked to deliver it discreetly. "From whom?" Purbright's tone remained as polite as if he were inquiring about the weather. The pastor hesitated. "Mrs. Carter Brown herself. She gave it to me a few days ago. She told me to keep it safe and make sure it reached the right people when circumstances warranted." "I didn't question her, Inspector. One is reluctant to pry into the private concerns of parishioners." Purbright inclined his head. A commendable hesitation. "And the circumstances that required it?" Prowse seemed stricken. "I can't say. I carried the paper, as requested. I thought it was a simple message of trust. I never thought it would turn out well, that she would collapse and die, and that my carelessness would cause her to drop it." He trailed off in a thin voice. Love cleared his throat to sound firm. "Do you know what the note said, sir?" "I never read it." I gave my word, although I must admit I missed the first few words, which I paused to reread. I shouldn't have. They seemed to hint at a scandal. He pressed a handkerchief to his forehead. Purbright let the silence linger until the minister, eager to fill it, added, "She's worried, Inspector." She spoke of threats, but wouldn't say where they came from. Only that her reputation might suffer. "Reputation is often the first victim of fear," murmured Purbright. He stood up, glanced at the spines, and nodded gently. "Thank you, Reverend. I think you can resume your duties without worry. At least for now." Back at the police station, Love said what many in the city had already suspected. "It had to be blackmail, sir." She relayed the message to him. Someone had threatened her, and maybe she'd had enough. "Perhaps," said Purbright. He had the widow's note back on his desk, next to the raffle account. His fingers tapped lightly on the entrance to the jewellery box. But if one wanted to deliver a threat, why choose a medium so easily lost or misplaced? Why not a letter signed with venom and bile? Why something so underhanded? Love frowned, struggling with the riddle. Perhaps it wasn't meant as a threat at all. "Or maybe that's how it was meant to look," Purbright replied. He closed the ledger with a quiet thud. "Shall we take a walk to the seed dealer? I think Mr. Penny has an interesting contribution." The seed shop was a cramped space that smelled of soil and fertilizer. Packets of flower bulbs lay there like exotic stamps. Mr. Penny, a thin man with constantly slipping glasses, greeted them with polite suspicion. "Tools?" "Yes, indeed. I donated the set for the raffle. Good quality. I was just here last week." Purbright looked at the scissors on display. A generous gift. Tell me, do you usually decorate them with ribbons? Penny looked confused. Ribbons? Certainly not. They come directly from the wholesaler. Why do you ask? Curiosity, murmured Purbright. A weakness of mine. He thanked the man and left. Penny remained scratching his head among the petunias. As they walked back down the cobbled street, Love couldn't contain herself. So, sir, it was a bond that caught your eye? Purbright made no reply, just a faint smile. That evening, the city received new material for speculation. At the Crown Hotel, where the uncollected raffle prizes were being inventoried, it was discovered that the silver-plated piece of jewellery, Bodies 1, donated by Mrs. Carter Brown, was missing. According to the ledger, it still hadn't been collected, but the shelf where it had been lying was empty. The hotel staff nervously insisted that no one could have taken it unnoticed, but it was gone. The news spread through Foxborough within an hour. The disappearance of the dead woman's loot so soon after her death was more than just a coincidence. The town declared it proof of a conspiracy. Some swear the jewellery box contained jewels, others insisted it contained documents. One agitated grocer even claimed it was stuffed with foreign banknotes. No one could say how they knew, but everyone spoke with certainty. When Purbright was informed, he simply adjusted his glasses and remarked, "Objects also have a reputation. Sometimes it's even more dangerous than that of people." Love, less calmly, asked, "Should we issue a notice, sir? Question the staff? Search the place?" "In due time. Let's first listen to the city. Perhaps in their imaginations they've already opened half of the jewellery box." He leaned back in his chair. "When everyone agrees on what must have been inside, we'll know exactly what wasn't." By nightfall, Flaxborough had gone from mere gossip to a state of near-frenzied madness. The widow's sudden death, the mysterious news, the minister's humiliation, and now the missing prize. Each event added a new layer of intrigue, and every contradiction sharpened the appetite for scandal. The windows glowed with lamplight, while the parlours filled with speculation. And somewhere among them, Inspector Purbright knew, sat the one for whom speculation was not pleasure but fear, for whom every news story tightened an invisible noose. His attention was focused on this silent observer, not on the noisy crowd. By Monday morning, Flaxborough's collective imagination had solidified into certainty. The missing jewellery box, rumoured to contain everything from diamonds to incriminating correspondence, had turned supposition into accusation. And it was Reverend Prowse, the poor man, upon whom suspicion fell with the inevitability of autumnal drizzle. The marketplace, the queue outside the post office, and the library steps hummed with the same refrain that the vicar had panicked, dropped his letter, betrayed himself, and then, with an unlikely sleight of hand, stolen the loot before it could further expose him. "Clergymen are only human," said Mr. Winch in his hardware store to an audience of 3, "and human beings are, as I always say, fallible. This box could have contained evidence of anything, debts, love affairs, or worse." No wonder he was sweating like a pig. "Quite right," agreed Mrs. Vine, who now had the courage to embroider. "And I saw him glance at the jewellery box at lunch. Shifty eyes, Inspector, I could tell. Why else would he turn so pale? Her claim was that she'd already found fertile ground for any offer that lingered in her shop long enough to have hems fitted. A clergyman embroiled in a scandal was infinitely more entertaining than a widow fainting from indigestion. In short, it was exactly the story the city needed. Sergeant Love, who had followed these rumours closely, presented his findings to Purbright with the seriousness of someone who had uncovered a conspiracy. "It's the minister, sir. Everyone says so. The note, the missing box, everything points to him. He must have taken it before leaving the hotel." Purbright, sitting with gentle calm behind his desk, didn't answer immediately. He turned the widow's note slowly between his fingers, as if waiting for the words to rearrange themselves. Finally, he said, "When everyone says love, it's usually safest to believe otherwise." The sergeant blushed but persisted. "Nevertheless, we should search the rectory, sir. If the box is there, indeed, if it's there." Purbright placed the paper neatly on the desk. "Let's stop by again, but not to conduct a raid, I think. We'll just ask." When they arrived, the rectory looked no less innocent than it had 2 days before. A rosebush hung by the entrance gate, its blossoms browned by the early frost. Reverend Prowse opened the door himself, his face pale and his collar slightly askew, as if neither mirror nor conscience had given him peace. With a resigned gesture, he led them inside. "You needn't bother, Inspector," he said with weary candour. "I've heard what the city says. You'll have me hanged in your mind before you can ask a question. Public opinion," Purbright gently noted, "is often an impatient judge. We prefer slower methods." The priest sat there heavily, twisting his hands in his lap. "The jewellery box, I swear to you, I never touched it. I barely noticed it among the other treasures. If it's missing, it's not my fault. I wouldn't risk such folly, Inspector. My reputation may already be ruined, but theft is not one of my vices." Love, still full of suspicion, pressed. "Can anyone confirm your whereabouts when the prizes were transported?" Prowse looked helpless. "Only the Almighty, I'm afraid. I left rather hastily, as you saw. My nerves were completely shot, but I came straight home. Ask anyone on the high street. They'll tell you I almost ran them over in my escape." Purbright listened continuously, his gaze not on the man but on a shelf of hymn books beside the desk. One, he noticed, had been carelessly pushed back, its pages slightly crumpled, as if they concealed something. He said nothing, merely put the remark aside and finally rose with a polite bow. "Thank you, Reverend. That's enough for now." Back at the station, Love couldn't hide his disappointment. "He's guilty, sir. You saw how nervous he was. And those hymnals are hiding something." "Nervousness," Purbright said mildly, "is an occupational hazard of innocence. And as for hymnals, they conceal little but bad poetry." He smiled weakly. "Let's not rush to rid the city of its convenient suspect. They've had too much fun with him. In the meantime, we can look elsewhere." They searched the hotel, but not in the way Love had expected. Purbright sent police into the hotel's back corridors and cellars, where the staff moved unseen. Questions were asked not about scandals at the rectory, but about unlocked doors, unbolted cupboards, and deliveries taken at the wrong entrance. The answers, when they came in, were confused and contradictory. A kitchen maid thought she saw the jewellery box put away before the end of lunch, and a porter swore it had still been there at the end of the day. A waiter recalled that Mrs. Carter Brown had made a fuss about it days before and insisted on placing it prominently on the table. By late afternoon, no one could agree whether the box had disappeared before or after the widow's death. This uncertainty seemed to amuse Purbright. "We have two certainties, darling. First, the box isn't where it should be. Second, no one knows when it disappeared. There's plenty of room for mischief in between." Flaxborough, however, was less impressed by ambiguities. By evening, the minister's plight was the topic of conversation at every tea table. His parishioners, divided between those who considered him persecuted and those who revelled in his shame, whispered over hymn books and collection plates. A delegation of church ladies even appeared at the police station, alternately protesting his innocence and demanding his arrest. Love tried to keep them in check, but their outrage filled the lobby until Purbright appeared and calmed them with a few polite words. He pronounced neither acquittal nor conviction, and the delegation left none the wiser, but strangely mollified, as if his calm had been a painkiller. That night, as the rain lashed against the station windows, Purbright sat alone at his desk, the widow's note again beside him. "Not here, not like this." He considered the words carefully, his expression unreadable. Finally, he folded the paper and returned it to the envelope. Then he looked up at the ceiling, where a faint creak indicated the building was settling down for the night, and murmured, "The city gives us a villain too quickly." That, I think, is her revealing confession. Love peered through the door and caught only the last word. "Confession, sir?" Purbright looked at him with that mild, irritated composure. "Yes, darling, but not the minister's, not yet." Suspicion against Reverend Prowse had reached such a fever pitch that even his sermons, once received with polite reserve, were now followed with the rapt attention usually reserved for scandalous events. On Wednesday evening, the church was more crowded than at Easter. Parishioners who hadn't attended church for years suddenly felt compelled to attend the service, or at least observe, to see if their minister betrayed himself in tone or text. The pews creaked under the weight of curiosity and judgment. Inspector Purbright, who rarely allowed himself to be disturbed by church matters on Sundays, discreetly plopped down in a seat at the back of the courtroom. Sergeant Love, taller and less discreet, sat beside him with the solemnity of a juror. They were motivated not by reverence, but by the certainty that if the city gathered in moral anticipation, the truth, or at least useful untruths, would come to light. The service proceeded outwardly decently until the hymnal caught the eye. The numbers showed hymns the organist had chosen days before and seemed quite ordinary. But when the congregation opened their books, the pages revealed something entirely different. "Instead of staying with me, lead us not into temptation." Confusion spread through the pews, then outrage, for the sung text did not match the notes being played. The organist faltered, the choir splintered, and within one verse the church transformed into a cacophony of voices, some pious, some amused. Of course it was Mrs. Vine who loudly announced that the hymn numbers had been changed. She had counted them earlier that day while dusting the lectern, and they were no longer the same. All eyes turned to the blackboard, where the wooden numbers now hung crookedly, as if a trembling hand had tampered with them. A murmur spread, who changed them and why? At that moment the pastor, intent on restoring order, completely lost his composure and announced the wrong collection. Laughter erupted from the back pews, silenced only by a hissing shout from a churchwarden. Instead, the congregation erupted in whispers that sounded like wind through the reeds. Purbright's gaze, aloof as ever, rested not on the agitated minister but on the hymn board itself. He rose amidst the confusion and strolled quietly to the aisle. A numeral, recently removed and replaced, bore a faint smear of green tape on its stylus, as if brushed by something that didn't belong to the church at all. He regarded it expressionlessly and then sat down again as if nothing had happened. The service was drawing to a close. The final hymn was sung half-heartedly, and the benediction was recited by a congregation already halfway out of their pews. Outside in the churchyard, rumours flared up again. The tampering with the hymn board was interpreted as evidence of deliberate mischief, perhaps even as a warning. Some swear it was the minister himself signalling guilt or remorse. Others insisted it was an enemy taunting him from his own pulpit. Theories multiplied as fast as mosquitoes in summer. Love muttered as they walked over. "They'll say this proves his guilt, sir, or that someone's trying to frame him. Either way, it keeps the flames burning." "Exactly," said Purbright. "The city has a remarkable appetite for fire, even when there's only smoke." The next day, people continued to talk. In line at the grocery store, the ladies in the barber's chair talked about little else. The men leaned forward to express their opinions. The consensus, if one could call it that, fluctuated between two poles. Either the minister had truly succumbed to madness and was announcing his fall in hymnals, or an invisible hand was determined to ruin him. Each possibility fed a different faction, and the split pleased both. Purbright spent the morning visiting the organist, a nervous man who lived above the music shop. The man swore he'd left the hymn board in order. "I've checked it twice, Inspector. Twice!" If anyone had altered it, it was only after I'd locked the vestry. He seemed genuinely shaken. His glasses had slipped off his nose. I thought it was just a prank. But after what happened, I don't even want to think about it. "Castles?" Purbright asked gently. "Are they often respected in Foxborough?" The man blinked. "Respectfully, sir." "By that," Purbright clarified, "I mean that the keys are freely reproduced in the community." The organist sighed. "You could say that. The sexton, the 2 churchwardens, the choirmaster, the flower committee, the youth group, everyone seems to own a copy. I doubt even the bishop knows how many." Purbright nodded as if he'd been expecting just that answer. He said goodbye without promising anything and strolled back to the station with Love at his side. The sergeant was bubbling with theories. "Someone's mocking him, sir, or sending him a message. That fits with the message she left, doesn't it? Not here, not like that." "A warning right in the church." Purbright didn't answer, but his gaze wandered to the flower shop window, where the chrysanthemums stood in orderly rows. Their paper tags, neatly tied with a green ribbon, fluttered gently in the breeze. The afternoon brought another small but telling development. The hotel porter, a young man with more enthusiasm than sense, appeared at the station. With the eager guilt of someone who wants to be praised for his honesty, he confessed that he had noticed Mrs. Carter Brown examining the jewelry box several times before lunch. She had opened it once in his presence, but he couldn't see what was inside. When he asked if it was safe to leave such a thing lying around, she snapped at him that it was meant to be seen and immediately closed the lid again. Love attacked this as evidence. "There you are, sir." She herself had hidden something in it. Documents, perhaps. And whoever knew that must have taken it. As usual, Purbright wasn't convinced by the theory, or perhaps she was just hinting that she'd been hiding something. Appearance, love, can be more powerful than reality, especially when you're planning an exit. The sergeant stared at her, not quite understanding. "You mean she knew she was going to die?" Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and went to the window. He looked out at the square where the townspeople bustled, their conversations audible even through the glass. He watched a group shake their heads to exchange words, saw them shake their mouths tighten, and their gestures quicken. It was less a conversation than a performance, each trying to outdo the other in inventiveness. Finally, he turned with a silent smile that never betrayed whether he was amused or sad. "The hymnal," he said quietly, "was clumsy theatre, but theatre nonetheless. Let's see who benefits most from the audience's applause." As dusk fell over Flaxborough, the pastor's situation became even more dire. Parishioners openly demanded his resignation. The manipulated hymns had confirmed to them that scandals were rampant in church-going. Circulate, and it was safer to believe the worst than to risk the embarrassment of innocence. But Purbright, sitting in his office with the widow's note in his hand again, sensed the threads pulling in a different direction. The city had committed its second act of unrest. He suspected a third wouldn't be long in coming. The chaos of the evening service hadn't subsided the next morning. Flaxborough, after having digested the hymn scandal with relish, awoke with a heightened appetite for speculation. The town, which under normal circumstances would have devoted its energies to potato prices or the state of bus service, now deployed every conceivable inventiveness for the pastor's supposed downfall. And yet, amid the hubbub, other names were whispered quietly at first, then louder, as the joy of spreading suspicion overcame loyalty. At the police station, the first of these new rumours broke out. Mrs. Comfrey, who had attended the luncheon but had spoken little so far, arrived clutching her handbag like a shield. She insisted on speaking to Inspector Purbright privately, and when she was ushered in, a torrent of revelations poured out. Mrs. Carter Brown, she said, had been arguing not with the clergyman, but with Mrs. Vine, the dressmaker. The argument was over. Unpaid alterations and allegations of fraudulent custom-made garments. According to Mrs. Comfrey, the widow had threatened to expose the dressmaker's shortcuts to the entire committee. She was determined, Mrs. Comfrey concluded with satisfaction, and I dare say Mrs. Vine was equally determined not to do so. Purbright listened seriously and thanked her with the courtesy he had shown to witnesses who delighted more in embellishment than accuracy. Nevertheless, he paid careful attention to the details. After Mrs. Comfrey had left, Love remarked, "That would be a motive, sir. Small things have led to worse." Later that morning, another visitor introduced himself to Mr. Penny, the seed dealer who had provided the gardening tools for the raffle. His demeanour was less eager than defensive. He wanted, he nervously explained, to correct a rumour already circulating that he had profited from Mrs. Carter Brown by billing her for the tools she had donated to him. "Complete nonsense, Inspector. They were a gift, at my expense. I wouldn't dream of such a rude approach." He dabbed his forehead. "But people talk, don't they?" "They will," Purbright agreed mildly, "sometimes to hide things they'd rather not talk about." This cryptic answer left Mr. Penny even more agitated than when he arrived, and Love remarked after he left, "Now they're all turning against each other, sir." "That's the nature of small towns," Purbright said. "Accusations are their most common outcome." That afternoon, the inspector decided it was time to visit Mrs. Vine herself. The seamstress received her in her shop, surrounded by rolls of fabric and the hum of her sewing machine. She was brisk and indignant, and avoided any suspicion that she had quarrelled with the deceased. Mrs. Carter Brown was a woman of extravagant taste and unsuitable proportions, she explained. If a dress didn't suit her, the fault lay not with my work, but with her figure. She threatened me with exposure. Ha! It was she who risked exposure every time she wore one of my creations. Love blushed, unsure how to pursue the matter, but Purbright just smiled faintly and asked if she had seen the jewellery box before lunch. Mrs. Vine hesitated. "Yes, I noticed it. A common little thing, a silver plate pretending to be silver. I told her so, even though she claimed it was an heirloom. An heirloom indeed," the woman could hardly tell brass, "from pewter." As they stepped back onto the street, Love shook his head. "If that isn't the motive, I don't know what is." "There are many motives," Purbright remarked gently. "I'm more interested in the opportunity. Many people harbour a grudge against the widow, but not all of them have their hands on the hymn book." The sergeant frowned as he remembered the green ribbon. "So the one who changed the numbers is the right one, sir?" "Maybe. Or maybe they just wanted us to think that." The evening brought further enlightenment in an unlikely location, the bar of the Crown Hotel. Purbright, who rarely drank more than a small glass of sherry, found occasion to sip one there, while Love, with exaggerated sobriety, treated himself to half a pint. Around them, Rotarians and tradesmen murmured conspiratorially. One remark caught Purbright's attention. In particular, a whispered claim that the widow had been corresponding with a lawyer in another city about her late husband's estate. It concerned a codicil to a will that could change the fate of many a Foxborough family. "Codicil," Purbright repeated quietly, rolling the word as if testing its weight. He casually dropped it into his notebook without further explanation. Love leaned forward and whispered, "Do you think that's what was in the jewellery box, sir?" Purbright smiled thinly. "That's what the city believes. It's rarely the same." The evening ended with a new scandal. As they left the hotel, the doorman who had spoken to them earlier rushed up, pale and nervous. He confessed to having seen someone loitering at the raffle table shortly before lunch began. Not the priest, but a woman in a green coat. He couldn't swear to her identity, but suspected it might have been Mrs. Vine. She looked around, lifted the lid of the jewellery box and hastily closed it again when footsteps were heard. Love rejoiced. "That's the crucial point, sir. The seamstress again." Purbright just raised his eyebrows. "That's nothing, dear. It only reinforces the embellishment. Still, it suggests that the widow's theatrical act with the box wasn't taking place without an audience. Which makes me wonder what she was trying to show them." They walked back up the high street in the dim lamplight, and whispers drifted through the curtained windows. The town's chorus of speculation had grown richer. A hidden addendum, a compromised vicar, a scorned seamstress, and a missing jewellery box. Each story contradicted the last, yet all were told with conviction. Purbright listened like an orchestra warming up before a performance, waiting patiently for the moment when discordant notes would betray the true tone. For he knew that in Foxborough the truth was seldom proclaimed with a loud cry. More often it crept in quietly, disguised as just another whisper among many, until the silence itself betrayed it. As Thursday morning descended upon Flaxborough, the codicil had become as tangible to the town as the war memorial or the branded watch. No one had seen it, no lawyer had confirmed its existence, yet everyone spoke of it with an air of long-standing familiarity, as if it had been part of the Carter-Brown estate for generations. The missing jewellery box, once a vulgar little trophy, was now considered the coffer containing this mythical document, and within a day town gossip had blown up a widow's breakdown into a full-blown inheritance intrigue. In line at the grocer's, Mrs. Comfrey solemnly announced that the codicil had disinherited distant relatives in favour of a mysterious companion. At the post office, a retired schoolmaster insisted that the church was being rewarded for years of devotion. By lunchtime, both versions had merged into something magnificent, from which the minister himself would profit thousands of pounds. That no lawyer had been named bothered no one. Fabrications have always been cheaper than proof. Inspector Purbright, however, was less interested in the alleged content of the codicil than in the readiness with which it was repeated. He and Sergeant Love spent the morning at the solicitor's office in Foxborough, a grim establishment with more dusty files than clients. Mr. Atkinson, the senior partner, received them with an expression of wounded dignity. "Codicil? Absolute nonsense. We've been handling the Carter-Brown cases for years, and not a single such document has ever crossed our desk." He leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. "But between you and me, Inspector, the widow was inclined to secrecy. She had a way of suggesting she knew more than she actually did. It was her way of maintaining her importance." Purbright nodded slowly. "An effective method until you rely on it too much. When they stepped out onto the street, Love couldn't contain herself. So it was just bravado, sir? She never had a codicil." "Possibly," said Purbright. "Or perhaps she had an idea for one that might be more dangerous than the document itself." The sergeant frowned. "So you want people to think you have it?" Purbright smiled weakly. "Ideas, darling, are portable. You can plant them in many minds at once, and each will nurture them to suit its own soil." In the afternoon they returned to the Crown Hotel, where the staff was still nervous about the missing box. The porter repeated his story about the woman in the green coat. The chambermaid added that 2 days before lunch they had heard Mrs. Carter-Brown speaking sharply to Mr. Penny. Something about a payment that hadn't been received yet, but the words were muffled by the half-closed door. "She sounded rather annoyed, sir," the chambermaid reported, pleased with her own perspicacity, as if she meant it. When Love heard this, he was convinced that Penny was hiding more than just gardening tools. But Purbright let the detail go, neither confirming nor denying it. Instead, he inquired about the hotel staff's activities on the morning of the luncheon. Here, too, there were numerous but contradictory answers. One swore the jewellery box had already been on the table when the first guests arrived. Another insisted it had only been there later when Mrs. Carter Brown had personally placed it prominently among the prizes. This ambiguity amused Purbright rather than frustrated him. It seems that the box was simultaneously present and absent, depending on the accuracy of memory. A curious state of affairs similar to the codicil. The evening brought new complications. Reverend Prowse, still shaken by the suspicions of his congregation, quietly entered the police station. He asked to speak to Purbright alone. When he was brought in, he confessed to having received a letter in the mail that morning, anonymous, unsigned, but clearly addressed to him. It warned him that more about his connection to the widow would come to light if he did not withdraw from his parish duties. The minister insisted fervently that no such connection existed. But what if people believe it, Inspector? Belief is worse than truth in this town. Purbright read the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it next to the widow's note. Faith, Reverend, is indeed a powerful currency, but the one who spends money is rarely suspected of owning the purse. The minister left no less concerned, although Purbright's calmness was somewhat reassuring. When Love asked if the letter had changed anything, the inspector shook his head. It changes nothing except the volume of the voices. Nevertheless, it suggests that someone is determined to keep the choir singing. By Friday morning, the town had settled into an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Parishioners were openly speculating about the pastor's resignation, and some were demanding a replacement before Sunday. At the same time, rumours about Mrs. Vine and Mr. Penny were growing louder. In the fabric store, a customer whispered that Vine had once been caught tampering with raffle tickets to her advantage. In the seed store, another swore that Penny had suffered heavy losses on an investment and could profit from any favourable changes to the Carter Brown estate. None of this was verifiable, but it was all eagerly believed. Meanwhile, Purbright decided to visit the widow's house. It stood on the outskirts of town, a modest brick building, its curtains drawn as if in perpetual mourning. The maid, a shy 19-year-old girl, reluctantly admitted them. In the living room, Purbright's eyes wandered over china ornaments, faded photographs, and a desk piled high with letters. He examined them without comment, but an envelope, addressed in handwriting unfamiliar to the maid, caught his attention. It had been postmarked only a week earlier from a town several miles away. It contained only a single line. "Be ready to present it when the time comes." Love exhaled sharply. "That must be what the codicil means, sir." "Or it might not mean anything at all," Purbright said quietly. "His ambiguity is his strength." He pushed the letter back into place. "But it suggests she wanted to be seen as the keeper of something precious." They left the house with more questions than answers, but Purbright seemed almost satisfied. On the way back, Love asked, "Do you think she orchestrated all this herself, sir? The box, the letters, the note?" The inspector paused to light his pipe before answering. The widow certainly had a talent for the theatre, but ultimately, the theatre needs an audience, and the audience decides how the play ends. That evening, as the lamps glowed in the parlour windows and whispers spread faster than the Evening Post, Foxborough prepared for another disturbance. The codicil had become a character in the drama, as real as the minister or the seamstress, and the town awaited its next appearance. Purbright, back at his desk, sensed it wouldn't be long in coming. On Saturday afternoon, Flaxborough's town hall, normally a place of yawn-inducing reports on drainage, allotments, and lamppost repairs, was so packed it was almost reminiscent of a circus. Word had gotten around that the council meeting would address the vicar question and, perhaps more tantalizingly, reveal something about the alleged widow's supplementary bill. It wasn't an official council matter, but Flaxborough never let legality get in the way of entertainment. On every bench, in every draughty corner, and on every squeaky chair sat citizens eagerly awaiting a new chapter in the scandal. Roll up. Inspector Purbright, who had no formal reason to be there, nevertheless discreetly took a seat in the back. Sergeant Love stood beside him, his notebook in his hand, as if minutes were being taken. The mayor, resplendent in his chainmail, opened the meeting with a pompous cough, but before he could deliver his speech, a commotion erupted at the front. The town clerk, pale and sweating, had dropped a folder of papers which scattered across the floor. A dozen eager eyes read them before the poor man could pick them up, and what they read was enough to turn a routine meeting into a riot. The papers were typed and unsigned, but clearly concerned Mrs. Carter Brown. One, read half aloud to an agitated alderman, read, "The jewellery box is for protection. Make sure it is displayed." Another darkly hinted at a revelation that would be made public if the conditions were not met. The conclusion was irresistible. The missing loot contained documents of such significance that even the alderman must have trembled. Chaos reigned in the hall. Voices were heard in unison. Some demanded the minister's immediate resignation, others insisted on calling the seamstress, and still more demanded that Mr. Penny explain himself. A matronly councilwoman loudly declared that she had always distrusted gardeners. The mayor's gavel banged in vain against the noise. Purbright remained seated, observing the scene with the detachment of a naturalist observing the ants' rampage. His gaze caught the dropped folder, and he noticed that it was not municipal stationery, but an ordinary cardboard folder such as those sold in the stationery shop 2 doors down from the Crown Hotel. The town clerk looked as if he wished he were invisible after picking it up. Purbright put the copy aside without comment. Meanwhile, Love scribbled furiously. "That proves it, sir. The codicil, the letters she was blackmailed with, and the box was right in the middle of it all." "Does that prove it?" Purbright repeated quietly, as if testing the fragility of the word. "It only proves that scattered papers stimulate the imagination faster than fire. We can reserve judgment on their origin." When the gavel finally restored order, the mayor pompously announced the adjournment. The hall emptied in a storm of whispers, speculation pouring across the square like water from a burst pipe. The story had already spread. The letters were signed, sealed in blood, written by the minister, forged by Mrs. Vine, or stolen by Mr. Penny. Each repetition intensified the drama, but none intensified the truth. Outside, Purbright lingered at the edge of the dispersing crowd. He watched Mrs. Vine stride away with stiff indignation, her cheeks flushed with more than mere embarrassment. Mr. Penny shuffled nervously in the opposite direction, avoiding all eyes, and the minister himself, surrounded by a group of disapproving parishioners, seemed so stricken that he hardly thought to lift his hat in farewell. Purbright remained unperturbed by all these impressions, although nothing escaped his eyes. That evening, the inspector, accompanied by Love, quietly returned to the hotel. They asked to see the council chamber where the folder had been deposited. The janitor, pleased by the attention, readily admitted them. Purbright examined the floor, the benches, and the lectern. His gaze fell on the gavel, whose handle bore a faint, waxy green stain that no one had noticed. He touched it lightly with his handkerchief, said nothing, and simply folded the handkerchief away. Back in his office, Purbright placed the cloth next to the widow's note and the anonymous letter to the minister. A collection was born, each piece another piece of theatre. The love that still hovered over him could no longer conceal his confusion. "Sir, everything points in a different direction at once. Sometimes it's the minister, sometimes Mrs. Vine, sometimes Penny. How can we filter the truth from all this confusion?" Purbright leaned back, his eyes half closed. The truth, love, often reveals itself not through contradictions, but through persistence. What recurs, however disguised, is usually our target. We must ask what common thread runs through the widow's theatrics, the jewelry box, the song tablet, and now these scattered letters. Love scratched his head, unable to answer. Purbright hadn't expected it either. Instead, he stood up, extinguished his lamp, and left the office with the calm assurance of a man who knew the next disturbance was already looming. For in Foxborough, scandals never rest for long, and the jewel box, whether empty or full, hadn't yet played its final scene. On Sunday morning, the hubbub of the council chamber still echoed through Flaxborough. Parishioners came to church less to pray than to stare at their minister, who looked ashen-faced beneath his collar. Mrs. Vine, striding past the pews with a hat brim as stiff as her demeanour, garnered equally greedy stares, while Mr. Penny, seated further back, played with his gloves so incessantly that even the organist lost his rhythm. The congregation resembled less a flock than a jury eager to deliver a verdict. In this atmosphere, Inspector Purbright's discreet presence in the rear pew went largely unnoticed, although Sergeant Love's massive frame did attract sidelong glances. The service passed without incident. The carefully checked hymn board displayed the correct numbers. But it wasn't the liturgy that occupied Purbright's thoughts, but the opportunity before him. With his usual gentle detachment, he watched faces whisper, avoid eye contact, and stiffen at the mention of faith, honesty, and forgiveness. His gaze fell on Mrs. Vine as the minister read a passage about vanity. She smiled tightly, a smile that belied the barb. Penny, on the other hand, coughed the whole time and dabbed his forehead as if wiping away guilt. Purbright jotted down everything and kept his impressions like rehearsals in a drawer. When the service ended and the crowd streamed into the churchyard, Purbright remained until most had left. Then, in a tone as casual as a neighbourly remark, he said to Sergeant Love, loud enough for those around him to hear, "That thing about Mrs. Carter Brown's jewellery box is quite odd. Empty as it must have been, you can always tell who expected something different." His words, delivered with gentle mildness, fell like a pebble into still water. He didn't turn to look at the waves, but Love, belatedly grasping their significance, looked back and saw them. Mrs. Vine froze for a brief moment, her gloved hand tightening on the strap of her handbag before she composed herself. Mr. Penny blinked rapidly as if something had hurt him. Only the minister didn't seem to have heard, or perhaps he was too tired to react. Purbright, satisfied with these little traitors in his expression, strolled off as if he had only noticed the weather. Back at the station, Love asked hesitantly, "Were you serious, sir, that the box was empty?" Purbright gave him an amused look. Opinion. Love is sometimes less useful than expectation. We don't need to worry about what the box contains, but only about what people thought it contained. Their reactions are, in fact, the contents. The sergeant frowned but dutifully scribbled in his notebook. He had learned to write down the inspector's contradictions, if only to puzzle over them later. That afternoon, Purbright paid another visit to the Crown Hotel. He asked to see the venue again. The manager, nervous but accommodating, admitted him. There, the inspector walked slowly around the tables and stopped at the spot where Mrs. Carter Brown had collapsed. He bent down, examined the skirting board again, and this time retrieved the clipped price tag he had previously covered with his shoe. It still dangled from a piece of green ribbon, now crumpled and slightly smudged. Purbright put it in his pocket, his expression unreadable. In a gentle voice he asked the manager, "Have you recently sold any items wrapped in green ribbon?" The man blinked. "Just a few of Mrs. Vine's packages, Inspector. She delivered them herself, raffle donations and such, always with that ribbon. She said it gave the whole thing a touch of distinction." "Ah," Purbright said only that one syllable, thanked him, and left. Love, who was waiting outside, rushed at him with a question. "So it's her ribbon after all, sir? She must have put it there." "Or it should look as if she had placed it," Purbright replied calmly. "Plays, darling, are never complete without props." The rest of the day was filled with new rumours. A rumour spread that Mrs. Vine had quarrelled with the widow not only over clothes, but also over the attentions of a wealthy gentleman, perhaps even a Rotarian. Others claimed that Penny had been seen at the widow's late one evening, but no one could agree on which evening or for what purpose. And still others whispered that the minister himself regularly delivered sealed envelopes to her, surely containing secrets too scandalous for the mail. By evening, the town's imagination had embellished more than a seamstress could have bequeathed. Purbright, however, allowed the tissue to grow unhindered. Only in the silence of his office did he allow himself to be put together. He presented the widow's note, the anonymous letter to the pastor, the tape remnants, the meeting minutes, and the price tag he'd just inserted. Each individually was trivial. Together, however, they formed a pattern of careful suggestion sufficient to direct suspicion in the desired direction. He sat there for a long time, pipe smoke curling in the dim lamplight, thinking not about what had been done, but about what had been arranged to make him believe it. That night, when it was finally quiet outside, Purbright murmured to himself, "A confession doesn't have to be in words. It often comes in haste, in glances, in silence, at the wrong moment. We've been offered many words, now let us wait for the silence." The next morning, the inspector's opportunity presented itself. He didn't need to formally summon the suspects. The town itself would gather them together and observe each other. He only needed a single remark in the right place to see who was losing their composure. And in Foxborough, the wavering was always louder than any scream. Monday morning dawned with a chilling chill that seemed to whet the town's appetite for closure. Flaxborough had had nearly a week of rumours, and although the town's imagination was running high, there was now a faint unease lurking beneath the chatter. People wanted a resolution, if only to ensure the stories they told at the hairdresser's or in line at the supermarket had a firm foundation. After all, even gossip needed a foundation. Inspector Purbright, having allowed the ferment to simmer unchecked, decided it was time to draw the curtain. He invited the principals, Reverend Prowse, Mrs. Vine, Mr. Penny, the mayor, and several aldermen, to the police station under the pretext of making clarifying statements. They arrived with varying degrees of reluctance, the minister pale and resigned, Vine brimming with injured dignity, Penny sweating as if he had been carrying his seed oven on his back, and the mayor puffed up with the smugness of being included in a supposedly official statement. Sergeant Love, notebook in hand, watched with expectant seriousness. Purbright, seated at his desk, surveyed them with the mild gaze of a schoolmaster about to test a naughty class. "You'll forgive the inconvenience," he began politely. "It seemed appropriate that we all review together the little drama we were involved in. It was a drama and intentional. Mrs. Carter Brown, whatever else one might say of her, had a penchant for the theatrical." Mrs. Vine sniffed audibly, but Purbright continued as if she hadn't said anything. "The jewellery box, for example, a vulgar object, yes, but at the raffle it was held out as if it were the Ark of the Covenant. She was determined to display it and admire it. Why? Not because of its contents, but because of what people might imagine. A murmur went through the room. Love leaned forward, pencil in hand. Purbright continued, "Our community is not lacking in imagination. At the end of lunch, it was said the box contained jewels, secret letters, and a codicil. The truth is simpler. It contained nothing at all. It was empty. The widow's genius, if we may call it that, was to convince you otherwise." The priest looked shocked. "And then the note she pressed into my hand?" "Another squiggly line," Purbright said gently. "A note with a carefully chosen, ambiguous sentence. Not here, not like that." She knew exactly how it would read the moment she broke down. It suggested threat, blackmail, and conspiracy. In fact, it was little more than a melodramatic line designed to stir alarm and suspicion. He paused and let the words settle and excite them. The mayor cleared his throat. "But the songboard, Inspector? Surely that wasn't a coincidence. On the contrary, it was part of the same play. Someone had tampered with the numbers and in their haste left a trail of tape. But here, too, the point wasn't to hide the truth, but to spread rumors. The entire performance was designed to draw attention not to the facts, but to the person they most wanted to blame. Our late widow loved importance, and with her death, she ensured that she would continue to be important. Mrs. Vine was angry. Are you saying she staged her own death?" "No," Purbright answered quietly. Death was staging itself as it always does. Her collapse was, of course, a sudden cardiac arrest, even if she couldn't have foreseen the exact moment. Nevertheless, she had prepared for it, spun props around herself. The box, the notes, and the whispered confidences to this person and that. She wanted to be remembered after her death, not as an ordinary parishioner with indigestion, but as the central figure in a mystery. He smiled weakly. In that, at least, she had succeeded. Mr. Penny wiped his forehead and stammered, "Then who took the box if it was empty?" "Ah, yes." Purbright's eyes sparkled. "The disappearance. Not a theft, but an embarrassment. The hotel staff, cleaning up after lunch, found it and mistook it for trash. A chambermaid, more practical than reverent, disposed of it. When the town loudly demanded its whereabouts, no one dared to confess, so the vacuum was filled with fabrications. It was easier to believe in a conspiracy than to admit clumsiness." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. The minister closed his eyes in relief, and Mrs. Vine's lips tightened in indignation at being suspected without reason. Penny slumped in his chair as if he had escaped the gallows. Only the mayor seemed disappointed, deprived of the dignity of presiding over a scandal. Sergeant Love scribbled furiously, then looked up in puzzlement. "But, sir, the green ribbon, the price tag you found." "Another prop," Purbright replied. "Perhaps cut from one of Mrs. Vine's packages or placed where it would be conspicuous. It was enough to direct suspicion toward her, which she seemed to be adept at stoking thanks to her temperament." The widow knew that a hint goes further than an explanation. She dropped hints generously. There was a long silence. Finally, the priest whispered, "So all this humiliation, the letters, the rumors, was it all just a show?" "Only?" Purbright's smile was serious. "A performance can hurt more deeply than facts. You can all attest to that, but rest assured, there's no blackmail, no codicil, and no conspiracy. Just a lady whose sense of drama exceeds the comprehension of her heart." The group slowly dispersed. Some murmured angrily, others were relieved, and no one was completely satisfied. Purbright watched them go with calm detachment. Love lingered behind and said in amazement, "So the whole city has been worked up into such a commotion for nothing, sir." "About theatre, dear?" Purbright corrected gently. And theatre is rarely nothing. It tells us what people want to believe, and that's often more instructive than what they know. Later, as dusk crept over the square, the inspector strolled alone past the Crown Hotel, the church whose hymns now quietly performed their numbers, and shop windows where faces still jostled for delicacies. He thought of the widow who had managed to attract more attention in death than in life. Flaxborough would soon return to his quiet pursuits, but a trace of the drama would live on in rumours retold and reshaped until it became tradition. That, he thought, might be her true legacy. He turned back toward the station with a leisurely step and a mild expression. Another scandal was over, another web of suspicions was unfolding. The city would rest until the next uproar set tempers ablaze, and Inspector Purbright would wait with his patience and calm eyes, ready to listen once more.